4 papers in this session, and the papers are all quite different. So what we'll do is we'll have a presentation, and then while we're doing the changeover, we'll do some questions, and then we'll move on to the next paper. I think that makes more sense since the papers are of such difference. So I'll introduce one of the presenters at a time. We have first Linford Fisher, who comes from Brown University, who will speak on the database of Indigenous slavery in the Americas. Take it away.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you all here. I have the difficult task of keeping you all from sliding into a food coma, which I will try to keep you awake. Thanks so much to Walter and the organizers. It's really great to be here to learn from you all, but also to be a part of the conversation. As you look down through the program, you might notice that we are somewhat of an outlier, the database of Indigenous slavery in the Americas, because we focus on Indigenous slavery and not African slavery, even though other projects touch on Native American slavery. But I'm glad to be included. I think it's really important to have these kinds of conversations and to bring together the histories of the African slave trade and Native American slavery as well. So for the past 3 years, I and a small team of researchers at Brown have been working on the database of Indigenous slavery in the Americas, or DISA, as we have come to call it. And in short, it's our goal to document as many as possible instances or individuals that have been enslaved anywhere, Native Americans who have been enslaved anywhere in the Americas between 1492 and 1900 or beyond. And even prior to 1492, if we can document that. We are still in the early phases of this project in some ways. So we have a working MySQL database and a backend entry form, which I'll show you in a minute. But we don't have anything that's publicly facing yet in terms of accessing the data itself. We're currently funded internally from Brown, but fingers crossed and knock on wood, hopefully that changes soon. So as you know, just quickly to give you a sense of the potential scope of this project, at least in small parts. The field of Indian slavery has really grown over the past 2 decades, and the estimates coming out of this scholarship are quite large, right? Anywhere between 2.5 to 5 million enslaved natives throughout the Americas up through 1880s. This other slavery, as one scholar has called this, is different in some ways. Someone earlier in this conference mentioned the difficulty of tracking enslaved Africans in certain parts of the Americas. The same is true and even infinitely worse for enslaved Native Americans. Native American slave trade is often not as well documented. Sometimes there's race shifting, other ways of hiding what's going on. Makes it very, very difficult to actually piece this together. But there's lots of research being done on this topic, just not a lot of centralization. So this database is an attempt to bring together a lot of different kind of people, a lot of different kind of data that's out there on enslaved Native Americans into one place that scholars and the public can actually access. So to get this project going, we decided to test out certain kinds of data and to form a small core to work with. This included runaway slave ads, and I know there's several projects in this part of this conference focusing on runaway slave ads, which is really fantastic, freedom on the move and so forth, runaway slave ads in Britain. So we also drew on detailed census records. Not all census records give you names and individuals, but this one here from 1822 happens to be from Mosquito Shore, which is present-day Nicaragua and Honduras. Also baptismal records from Spanish colonies, from Andres Resendez and Nancy Van Dusen, a smattering of other probate records and miscellaneous records from various places. So collating all these together, we have approximately 550 entries of enslaved natives as a test, just to sort of see how this looks and feels and how we can manage what's going on. So as I mentioned, we don't have a back end, a front end, a public-facing front end to show you. So what I want to do is to kind of walk you through the actual back end entry form and then talk through some of the conceptual kinds of questions and problems that we have. And I forgot to preload this. Let's do this, sorry. We have been building a proprietary back-end entry form, which in some ways is frustrating. I feel like we are reinventing the wheel unnecessarily. And so I would love to talk to you about why that's the case, maybe, and what we could lean upon that would allow us to not reduplicate efforts. This is the back end, essentially, for those of us who are working on this. And from the beginning, one of the core problems, the core questions we had is how to balance making a database about documents versus about people. And so you can see here, this is organized around documents on the back end, even though we're really insistent, I'm insistent, that the front end search interface be about people, in part to sort of mitigate against the dehumanization that's inherent with database projects, right? Thinking of Jessica Marie Johnson's recent essay, Markup Bodies, and so forth. But so right now it's around documents, and if you would click on one of these documents, you have 4 layers of entry so far, which can be a bit confusing, and we're working on how to streamline this a little bit. So you have this essentially the first layer is just the citation information. This will be linked to a push API into Zotero to manage the bibliographic information for us. Comments, acknowledgements. After you all send your data to me to enter in, we will acknowledge you here in this box. The next layer here is you can add an item or an event, it's essentially the same idea, to a document. Here it's a runaway slave ad that is the item within this document. And you have different things that you can put in terms of location, really specific location, the date and so forth, as well as a transcription that is fully entered here. The next layer, though, is people within that event or item, and you can put in the first and last name if you have it, give some description, but then also the details of each individual person can be entered here as well. But what's powerful about MySQL, as I'm sure you know, is the way in which you can create relationships between different kinds of people. So if you think about, and for some reason it's not showing up. Why is that? Is it possible that it's there? So we can actually try to tell the database precisely in what way people are connected, which is useful for us in terms of tracking people and thinking about how they relate over time. We also have been trying to keep track of them in terms of an index of overall people in the database. We are entering enslaved people, but also other non-enslaved people, again, to sort of highlight the possibility and potentiality of connections. And if you click on them here, you can kind of see a snapshot of not only the details, but also the relationships and the timeline if you have multiple sources from this person. So that's kind of where the backend is at. We have a actual website that contains nothing really at this point. It's just a placeholder to kind of give people a sense of what's going on, a board of advisors. If you access the database, there's nothing there yet, but hopefully that will change. Have a way to think about contributing as well over time. What I want to do next, though, is just talk briefly about a number of challenges and conceptual ideas that we keep on working through. And it's interesting sitting back there and listening to all of you present on your projects. I feel like we're all kind of reaching in the same directions of some of these ambiguities and challenges. So this is nothing really new here. Some of them are a little more specific to Indigenous slavery, I think, but basically I think we're all kind of in the same boat. The one first sort of set of questions is about definition. How do we define slavery? So African slavery can be variable for sure, but Indigenous slavery is highly variable, and you have different kinds of terminology that's used, ranging from what we would consider chattel slavery to very temporary kinds of enslavement, maybe a couple days or a month, or forced involuntary indentures by parents and so forth, right? Different kinds of unfreedoms that might not be slavery. And so the question is, how do we take all that in? Do we want to include all of that? And I think the answer is we do. The question is just how to make that apparent that we're talking about this diversity. Race, a lot of intermarriage. One of the things that I've been working on with this book on Indigenous slavery as well as this project, is to make sure that we are recovering Indigenous identities in places where the archives have tried to squelch them. So this racial recategorization takes place. You might find a mulatto man described as having long, straight black hair, right? And other kinds of ways in which we can think about racial identity being very complicated. Same is true with tribal and other identities. These are often stripped away. Structural problems we all deal with, trying to keep track of the same person across multiple documents, but also for the database's purposes, trying to think about ways in which we can take in documents that are not specific, all right? So you have an instance where there's 30 enslaved natives being sent off somewhere, right? How do we keep track of that in a document that's about people, where there are no people listed, but you have a number? So we're thinking about ways to integrate these documents as well. This is an example maybe of a document that lists numbers of natives but not actual individuals. On the left-hand column is the places where they're being held as slaves. We have ethical and moral questions. How do we involve descendant communities? We talked about this already today. Also, how to think about what it would look like to devise this as an indigenous database, actually, is a question that I think is intriguing. Practical questions about scale, possible crowdsourcing to really make this functional. And I think the kinds of things that will come out of this have already been apparent with our 550 test entries in terms of gender, age, diversity of freedom, race, potentially geotagging items in the future. All of this, I think, will be useful and helpful for all of us as we develop this over time. So I'm out of time. This is just a thanks to people and centers at Brown that have funded this so far. So thanks very much.
Questions?
Thank you for your presentation. I was wondering whether the database will be about indigenous enslaved people in the United States only, or are you going to include also people in other American countries?
So the question has to do with, I'll say the question since the mic is here, and then you can go. So the question has to do with whether or not the project is focused on the United States or more broadly.
The idea, the vision is to have the Americans as a whole. We've started with stuff mostly in North America, not entirely though, just to see where this takes us and to make sure it's viable. But yes, get back to me in like 10 years and we'll see how things are.
So the question has to do with what happens in many parts of the Atlantic, which is if Native American slavery is illegal, the saying that this person is African or black rather than listing the enslaved person as Native American.
I think my short answer is we're aware of this, and all we can do is put the document ourselves, at least initially. But I think part of what we can do for the public and for scholars or whatever else is have essays that sort of contextualize these kinds of problems, and also just try to triangulate information. And there's cases I know from my own research where it's clear that people show up in different contexts and are given different kinds of racial and ethnic tags, and so you can triangulate information partially solve that. But this is a fundamental problem that I'm not sure we can solve precisely with this database, but at least using it to raise that awareness, I think, is a really important tool. Something we could do. There's something back here. Yes, go ahead.
Yes, you practically answered this. One of your examples was Mosquito Coast. So I'm just wondering if you at all looked at the materials in Spanish in 1741, the assembly there abolished Union slavery, and they kept registering people that were almost all of them, many of them, maybe most came from.
So the question has to do with Mosquito Coast and sources in Spanish. Mosquito Shore.
Mosquito Shore, yeah.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you for the question. So I have not found, in 1741, the assembly commands that a registry be made. I've not found that registry, but there's registries of 3 persons that runs from the 1760s on at least, and that we've used some of that as well. But Mosquito Shores is an untold story in many ways, and I think you're right to highlight this. As you know, Indian slavery, the Indian slave trade doesn't stop in 1741 just because of laws passed, right? But this is certainly something, the Spanish side of this story is something we hope to be taking into this as well.
Okay, we have time for one more question. We had a question back here. Did you have, no? Okay, Ethan?
How are you wrestling with or engaging with Indigenous individuals being enslaved by other Indigenous communities, Southeast Plains?
Yeah. I mean, anytime a Native is enslaved, it's, eligible for the database in a way. I mean, this is a complicated issue and question. We want to be sensitive about it, but I think that this is not necessarily only a database about Europeans and Americans and whoever else enslaving Native people, which is something we've not specifically added to the database yet or come across concrete examples to put in, but it certainly is a part of that story. Thanks.
So, okay, one more, Paul.
One source that you might look at is Marcel Fidel's because I mean they're 3/4 of the slaves in France were Indian, and it's actually you can increase your database of Roosevelt's students by several couples.
And actually, so the suggestion was to look at Trudel's sort of listing and work on enslaved natives in New France. And there's actually some Indigenous groups and tribal members who contacted me recommending that exactly, but also having specific tribal ties back to some people on that list. And so wanting this data to be in the database so they can use it for themselves, which is really useful. So it's on the agenda. Haven't gotten to that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Linford. So it's a great pleasure now to introduce Adam Arenson from Manhattan College, and he will be presenting on After the Underground Railroad. I'm sorry, this is written so small. Oh, I can read it there. Tracking African North Americans across the U.S.-Canadian border in the Emancipation generation. Adam?
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. As you can tell, we've moved to a very different geography and a very different place and time than a lot of what we've been hearing about today. But as Linford just mentioned, there are a lot of the same issues that play into these questions in terms of how to build these databases. What I have been trying to do is we've been talking a lot about trying to move from numbers and networks to individuals. I feel like my project kind of has the opposite problem, that there are a number of particularly prominent people, some of whom I have here, some of whom have ties to Michigan, and you'll see that there's a lot of Michigan in this story. But what I want to do is try to figure out, beyond the kind of headline names who come to mind right away, how do we figure out how big a movement there was? I think that people know the Underground Railroad story to a certain extent, but in their mind it just sort of ends. When Emancipation comes or when people reach Canada, even the National Underground Railroad Museum, it spends a lot of time, centuries. You get to people getting to Canada, and then there's like one hallway that leads to the gift shop that covers from 1860 to the present, right? So the individuals who were held in slavery in the United States, in Canada in some cases, who escaped into the United States is a complicated story in the Great Lakes region. What happens after they reach freedom is a story that in my experience has not been told in a prosopography kind of way, in a group way. It has been told in individual cases, and I want to help tell that story. I have lots of little hints, right? These are Canadians who are becoming lawyers in the South during Reconstruction. For example, the first salmon label in British Columbia is an African-American, or an African-Canadian, if you want to think of it that way, in Victoria. The person who creates the label is also an African North American, Grafton Tyler Brown, who by the end of his life is passing as white in Montana. The largest bank in Chicago before the Great Depression is owned by people who come out of a family who had spent time in Canada. The person who integrates Ford Motor Company is also born in Canada. And part of what happens is, in the United States, people talk, for example, about William Perry, but they don't talk about the fact that he's from Amherstburg, right? Or they talk about the Bingas in Chicago, but they don't talk about the tie to Canada. Similarly, in the records, and I think the next slide is my, I'll get back to it. In a minute, you'll see a list of all the various archives I've been to. The Canadian records are very good in terms of family trees. They have really good family trees of the people who came as fugitives and sort of their family members down to today in a lot of the African Canadian communities. But when people go to the United States, there's normally like an asterisk, and it's sort of like went to the United States, and like end of story. There's nothing more to say about that part of the family. I've found lots of interesting individual records, whether it's about economic failures or successes, different kinds of charity records here in Detroit, for example. I'm interested in tracing all kinds of networks. So I think the genealogical networks are sometimes the easier ones. I also have a bunch of Masonic records. I have church records. There's a whole Sunday School Union group of people who come out of Canada, are trained in either Michigan or in Nashville, and then go back to Canada or go other places around the world. And so this is the project. I'm really at the beginning. This is my third book project. Some of my earlier work is on St. Louis and slavery, and I'm currently teaching a class on slavery in the Bronx and these unmarked slave cemeteries. So I have lots of connections to this work at the moment. This is a sense of the places I went the year I had an NEH in 2013-14 to gather this stuff, and I've kind of been sitting with it. I also finished a different book in the meantime, but while I've been sitting with it, I've been trying to figure out what is the ideal form to put this stuff in. And you'll see at the end, I really had that question of what someone, I'd like to have the form that I can put this stuff in. Obviously, there does not seem to be that ideal form existing at this moment, but maybe together we can think about what those categories need to be. And I'm happy to share this stuff. So other than that NEH, these have all been tiny grants from my employers or other organizations that I've worked with so far, like $1,000 when I say tiny. But there's a huge set of scholars who have filing cabinets or have various kinds of collections, community historians, scholars who've worked on questions around abolition and the Underground Railroad. And by, as we're seeing with a lot of these projects, the opportunity by putting them in databases and letting other people reach into them in a new way means we can ask different questions out of data that's already been gathered and thought through. What I want to highlight today is there are a lot of these individual lives, right? There's an effort to figure out what is the right way to put in a SQL database someone like this, right? This is Elias Jones. Okay, so he was born in North Carolina. He lives in Oberlin, but he also lives in British Columbia. And then he goes back to Oberlin, right? So I need to kind of watch his movements across time, different places. I have various dates linking him. I have photographs, which I know for those of you who work in the colonial period, you're like, ooh, photographs. There are lots of these stories about the way in which individuals have these connections to a bunch of different places. You can see in the case, for example, this is another individual, Jesse Grant, who was in Ontario but lived in Chicago, Washington, Toronto, Hamilton, and you can see the variety of jobs he held over time. Another example, George Burroughs in Ontario, but his children are in London, Ontario, and in Cleveland. He dies in Detroit. He has grandchildren in Toledo. Right? So I'm trying to figure out how to get all this information into a form that will allow me to map these networks and to show these connections geographically and across all these different spaces. And again, I've seen books where people could, I could write a paper about each of the people I've talked to you about, but I want to think about this as a group. And the question of how big this group is the main question that I'm going to focus on for the rest. Oh, I guess two more things to show you. Even more complicated are in the Civil War pension files, you have these great accounts where people have to prove they know people from before the war. So you get things that say like, yes, I knew him when we both lived in Windsor, Ontario. And then I enlisted in Detroit, but he enlisted in Buffalo. And later we saw each other in Alabama. Right? So there's all kinds of geographic and temporal information there. How to get that in, especially because a lot of it is very fuzzy, is kind of an ongoing question. Here's yet another example. This is someone who is in St. Louis, but they are born in St. John, New Brunswick. Right? So there's lots of possibly unexpected geographic movement in documents, but again, there's lots of data, and there's Boston there in the middle. You can see about that's when he arrived in the United States, and then he's applying for citizenship in 1870 in the United States. One of the other aspects of this that I've sort of discovered is that we often think of the key immigration laws as being 1790, when they sort of moved to a free white model of who can join the United States as a naturalized citizen, and then 1882 with Chinese exclusion. But in 1870, there's actually a law passed saying that people of African descent are allowed to naturalize as citizens of the United States. And the reason for that is because there are these African Canadians coming back, and they want to reconnect. That's at least what I'm arguing about that piece of it. This is a manuscript census that, for example, is not in places like Ancestry at all that I've digitized completely, 1864 Windsor census. Windsor's trying to figure out how many people have arrived from the United States because of the Civil War, both Confederates and African Americans fleeing the riot in Detroit. There's a big binational homecoming every year in Buxton, which I've been to a few times. And these people, for example, one of them lives in Michigan, one of them lives in Pennsylvania, others live in Canada. And here they are honoring their ancestor whose grave is in Buxton, Ontario. Okay, so with the time left, I want to show you what I've been able to work out with my students at these various institutions and help with the New York Genealogical and Biographical Society to figure out how to do this. We were able to pull everyone marked as black or mulatto in the US Census from 1860 to 1930 from Heritage Quest at a moment when that was possible. It's no longer possible, but I'd love to be able to have that ability to pull demographic sets again. As you can see, there's all kinds of numbers. And like the 1900 number, you can see it's 6,500 households. I know there's a lot of messiness in that data. For example, NS in that particular year we might think means Nova Scotia, and in some cases it does, but a lot of the time it means not stated, meaning they don't have the information. So there's just a lot of really messy data to be worked with. So far, what I'll show you next is that 600 households at the bottom that I've been able to confirm because I'm manually going through matching birth years and names and locations, trying to do it that way. So I love ideas about how to do it better. But from what I just said, I've been able to create this set of maps, which I'm going to animate you through, okay? So these are those individuals who are born in Canada and yet are living in the United States 1860 to 1930. This is where they are, okay? So there's every single one of these slides, there's a whole chapter to be thought about, but this is what I've got so far. So there's 1860, there's 1870, there's 1880, 1900, which again might be because that data is so messy, 1910, 1920, and then the very few people who were alive at the time of emancipation in the United States still alive in 1930, according to the census. So that's just a look at what I hope I'll be able to do with this information. On the other hand, I'm also trying to work this stuff through in terms of individual lives. I'm identifying these families because I want to tell stories beyond the kind of, Marianne Shedd Carey, Mifflin Gibbs, people we know about, because a lot of these families, what I hear is like, oh, well, we just went for the job, right? Like we moved to Michigan, but it was only because that's where Ford was or whatever. Well, there's a whole story of economic, migration and networks there that needs to be told. So I come in my last 2 minutes with a demand list. So this is the kind of stuff that I'm interested in thinking through, right? That there are standards out there. There's a genealogical set of standards. There's the IPUM standards in terms of the way global data is currently held. What kind of database is the right kind of database, right? What's the right entry form? What's the way to think about interoperability? And then that bottom item about demographic extracts, right? If I can go back and pull, the Canadian censuses exist in places like Ancestry and other sources, but you can't pull out everyone who's marked as African or marked as Baptist in the same way that allowed me to do that work with Heritage Quest. And so I'm trying to work through those questions in order to figure out how big this group is, it will help us figure out how many people went into Canada and then also how many people came back. I also want to compare with the people who stayed in Canada. I'm just at the beginning of this project, but a lot of these questions I hope to be informed by the questions of people who've been working at this for a long time in other databases of slavery. Thank you.
Questions for Adam?
Yes.
I have two. One is the gentleman by the name of Burroughs, born in Ontario. Was he an enslaved person?
So I'd have to go back and look at the birth year.
It said 18 before.
If he was born in the 1800s in Ontario, he was not born enslaved, but his parents were probably born enslaved either in the United States or in Canada. I'd have to go back to the details.
His parents may have migrated, and then he was born in Ontario before 1865.
Yes, right, exactly. Or he could have been enslaved in Canada before 1793.
Ah, okay.
Depending on his exact.
My second question was, you say you have the churches inside your data, and my question is, was the AME church, the Baptist church, those two traditions, which was the stronger in the American presence?
So if you look at the Canadian records, because Canadian records tend to mark religion but not race, and the American records are the opposite. So in the records, when you're looking for people of African Canadian descent in this period, you can find Baptists in AME or BME. There are generally more AME in Ontario.
Wait. You can find Baptists in AME or...
They're either marked Baptist or AME or BME for British Methodist Episcopal.
Which is not Baptist.
No, it's AME in Canada, basically.
Okay, I know that issue, but I guess I'm trying to hear
Ontario I've looked at. There are maritime communities, there's British Columbia, there are other pieces of the puzzle. But in terms of the southeastern Ontario, this area, it's generally A&E.
Thank you.
Other questions for Adam?
Yes.
Are you in any way working with the Afro-Nova Scotians? There's a big
Yes.
organization of genealogy groups.
Yes, so in the NEH year I had, I got to British Columbia and to Ontario. I've not yet gotten to the maritime provinces myself in terms of records. I know there's a lot of work done there. Generally, the African Canadian communities in the maritime provinces represent coming at the Revolution, right? So they're at least a generation older. On the other hand, a lot of the people you see in the Northeast on these maps that are in the Boston area are maritime African Canadians. So that is, you know, on the long list of questions to figure out about this project. You know, I originally thought I was looking at people who had been enslaved themselves, who went to Canada, who went back to the South. There are such people, but they're a small group compared to the group who end up mostly in places like Toledo, Ypsilanti, Lorain, Ohio, etc. And then there's another group in the Northeast who are more related to the Maritimes, and how to balance all those things. And the folks in the British Columbia almost always go to Oregon or Washington. So like, there are a lot of questions to be sorted in terms of what this project will look like in the final form. At the moment, I'm trying to say yes to all of that and bring everything in.
Anybody else? Okay, thank you very much,
Thank
Adam.
you.
So I will now welcome back to Michigan State University Nick Ribianszky. She received her PhD here. It seems like only a few short years ago, but I was at the dissertation defense. I remember it. So welcome back, Nick. Nick will be presenting, Nick is currently at Queen's University, Belfast. She'll be presenting on contested freedom, movement, and gendered violence among free people of color in Natchez, Mississippi, 1779 to 1865. Nick?
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Perfect. All right. So, yeah, I do feel right at home. You know, for a number of reasons. I feel like my project kind of situates itself within the last panel that was just on, or was it the last panel or 2 panels ago last panel, I'm sorry, Louisiana, and Annie Lenton's project. Where did you go, Anne? It was very familiar because we both look at free women of color, and I'll talk about how mine has changed over time. This is a product of 23 years of research. And I used to do archaeology, and there was a guy in my office that we used to kind of joke about that he hadn't written his dissertation yet because he was a hair splitter and a worrier, and it was 30 years after the fact. His name was Bob, by the way. I am the new Bob. So this project kind of grew out from my master's research, which was on free women of color in Natchez, Mississippi, who owned property. And so I was looking at, you know, just this really fascinating group of people who I know a lot of you do work on as well. People who were of ambiguous kind of status. They weren't enslaved. They weren't completely free. I'm looking at this sliding between legal states. Some of them were not born free. They were born enslaved and got their freedom. Some of them did not remain free, and they were re-enslaved for a variety of offenses, not paying their taxes, being accused of crimes and that kind of thing. So interesting, you know, group of people. Obviously, that's an understatement. The questions that I was asking when I was, working on my master's with property ownership, you know, trying to put together some sort of demographic on the women themselves. What did the data say about their age when they were emancipated? Property ownership, what type of property was it? Was it personal estate? Was it real estate? Was it enslaved people that that they owned? And some of them were slave owners. Some of them owned, just like the question that Dr. Midlow Hall asked, some of them did own family members. Some of them owned enslaved people for economic reasons. So all of these kinds of things were animating me while I was writing my master's. I returned to MSU. I actually did 3 degrees here. MSU is a great place, as you guys who came in for the first time are probably finding out. But I came back in 2005 to do my PhD program. And I decided to expand my analysis from free women of color to use gender as a tool to really find out, the differences between, this is how Natchez has been memorialized in a lot of ways, a book that was written in 1954, The Free Barber of Natchez, using, sorry, we can't see it very well, but the antebellum diary of a free person of color, William Johnson, who kept a diary from 1835 to his death in 1851, and really interrogating how freedom looked for men in Natchez, and then those of you who do work on this area of the world, you probably are familiar with Lois Meacham Gould's work publishing the letters and diaries of the women in his family. So looking at how gender shaped not only freedom, but I was looking, and I am looking at violence, how it was experienced by people of color differently for males and females, movement, and looking at movement in a number of different ways. The type of movement that you would expect, moving from one geographical place to another, looking at migration, looking at the people who moved into Natchez, Mississippi from other places with the movement of the slave trade from the traditional eastern seaboard regions and moving into the deep south, people that were moving from the Caribbean to the lower Mississippi Valley, and then thinking of movement also between legal states, from what I was talking about with the shifting from enslavement to freedom and sometimes back again. So these are the kinds of questions that really animated me. And like Dean was saying at the beginning of this conference, that these stories that we talk about, that all of us talk about, there's a lot, I'm a pretty cheery person, I like to think of myself, but there's a lot of really dark types of things that we have to deal with a lot of times when we're talking about violence, but we do have to keep our minds on the fact that a lot of these stories that we're telling are survival stories, they're perseverance, and no one of them is really the same as the other. So the database that I've created that I would love to have feedback on from you all, it consists of roughly around 900 individuals that lived between 1779 and 1865 in Natchez. And Natchez, similar to New Orleans, was under the jurisdiction of a number of international governments, the French, the British, the Spanish, and the Americans. And I'm looking at the Spanish period from 1779 to 1795, and then the American acquisition of Natchez after that. So just like a number of people have commented on with databases, there is this issue of possible repetition with individuals. I'm gonna change gears. I'm sorry, I wish I would have organized a little bit better with this, but just to give you a little insight into the research process, when I started doing work in the courthouses in Natchez in the mid-90s, I was trying to madly transcribe every document that I came across in the courthouses and putting it together, trying to make sense out of it. And then lucky for me, digital technology came around so I can take pictures of the documents. And then much to the frustration of my dissertation advisor at the time that I was writing my PhD, I wanted to create this database so that I could try to manipulate some of the information that I was finding. So this is what I called the index of families, and it's alphabetically organized. And just like all of our information, sometimes we don't have names of people, sometimes we only have their first names, sometimes we do have the last names. And so every time that I saw certain people within the documents, I tried to organize it in this way. And then the database was the second part of that. And so just trying to put these together. And it's funny, I feel like I can use that car analogy that a lot of Cadillacs have kind of come before me with this. This is, I don't even know, the Pinto, 1974 Pinto. So I'm really hoping that you guys will provide some feedback with this, because like a lot of people did, I did a database. I'm not sure why this is scrambled right now. I think I must have changed. Hold on, I'm sorry. I joke with my students about how I'm the least technologically, gifted person out there. Okay, well, you get the idea. It is like a number of the Excel files that we've seen. It's organized by last names, as much information as I can possibly put together. Cool. I'm so sorry, but I'm just going to close this out for a second because obviously it got saved in a way that I don't want it to be saved. Sorry, it did get scrambled somehow. All right, Matrix, I'm yours. Please school me on this. All right, so it is supposed to be, and you guys, I passed out a sheet. It is in alphabetical order by last name, and so you can see the categories with that. I tried to color code to separate out family groups and individuals and try to organize for myself. The C through H, I think, are the years that these individuals show up within the documents. And then there's a whole other, starting with the M, row M, it's dealing with if they were property owners. Then the next column is record type that they showed up in deeds, police records, census data, will books, and that kind of thing. And then the category of O is the one that I'm especially interested in. And I said, you know, my mind really does go to these kinds of dark places in looking at violence and how people experienced violence. So the categories of analysis within this category of violence, it's, you know, dealing with how people experienced violence themselves. If they were born enslaved, I was considering that an aspect of violence. If they were accused of different crimes, if they experienced any sorts of assaults on their persons, beatings, whippings, which many of them did, if they were sexually assaulted, but then also considering how they might have participated in violence as well. If they were associated with it, if a family member had experienced violence, trying to consider that as well. And then, like I mentioned, some of them were slave owners themselves. So if there were records that indicated punishment of enslaved individuals, that would fall within that category as well. So looking at that, also looking at, you know, their age, if I had that information, their classification as black or mulatto, which is really the only categories that were considered in Natchez. If they had children, if they were passing as white or as Native American, because I do a number of the free people of color in Natchez were mixed race, over 75% of them, and if they were property owners, the percentage of that increases. And a number of them were passing as white, and so that aspect is very interesting to me in this project as well. So basically, you know, just trying to use this database as a way not only to try to, you know, collect this information in a very logical way, but also my hopes are to digitize it, to share it with other people that are doing work on this, but also people that are doing genealogical work on their families and, you know, trying to make it available through that. So, yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Nick. Questions for Nick? Yes.
Yes. Why is there a question mark behind sexually exploited?
It's such, if I think that they were sexually exploited, it's a possibility. So I just, you know, I tended to err on the side of assuming that people were, but having that question mark that it's not necessarily an established fact, but trying to flag it for myself.
I want to piggyback on that. How do you distinguish between domestic abuse, sexually exploited, and beaten and assaulted? How do they distinguish each other, these categories?
What was the last one? I'm sorry.
You have here 3 different categories that I cannot imagine how you distinguish them. One is beaten, assaulted. The other one is domestic abuse, and then you have sexually exploited. Okay. How do you distinguish these 2 categories?
Okay, that's a good question. So I'm sorry, I did not repeat the question the last time, but the question was, how am I distinguishing between beaten, assaulted, sexually abused, domestic abuse?
Yeah.
Basically, anytime that an individual shows up in the documentary record as having been beaten or assaulted, there are some court cases here that give insight into the fact that some people were assaulted on the streets. So those kinds of things I'll distinguish in that way. Sexually exploited women that show up in the record as having interracial children. I am putting that together within that category because even though it's very difficult to make judgments in the record about if it was an actual rape or coercion, there's so many gradations, so I was just really putting all of them within that category. And then domestic assault for partners that were together, married couples and that kind of thing. The diary that I showed of William Johnson goes into a lot of detail with the people of Natchez, and he gives insight into some, couples, violence between couples. So that's how I was distinguishing. Hopefully that's.
Well, I think again the gray zone between. I mean, there's a gray zone between them because.
There is.
And
Absolutely.
Where
So.
do you put sex slaves, enslaved people that were sexually used? Clearly, for the purpose zone, like the fancy girls in New York. They are not in that category.
To be honest with you, I'm trying to run through all of the database right now in my mind. I'm sure that some of the women that did receive their freedom in that way would be classified as such, but as far as the documents that I've got, they weren't explicit in that classification of them. So yeah, but I would include those people under the category of SE question mark a lot of times. So. Yeah, there is a lot of ambiguity within the entire, people of color, people of color, people who lived on the margins, or middling people, and so there are shades of gray with that, and that is one of the frustrating things about classifying with a database, where we really want these sorts of very clear-cut answers. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Nick. And our final paper on this panel is Helen Kilburn, who comes to us from University of Manchester. The title of the paper is The Romish Empire, British Catholic Imperialists in the Early Modern Atlantic. Helen?
So thank you to the organisers and also to everyone else who's presented already. I'm going to be discussing today a project which remains in the concept phase and for which I'm currently looking at funding bodies and things like that. So I'm looking to learn from this conference, but would also be really grateful to hear your feedback on the design of it so far. I should also outline a couple of disclaimers at this point. The first one is I'm going to be focusing more on the British and Irish Catholic Studies side of this, simply because I suspect that many in the room are more familiar with the slavery side of it than with British and Irish Catholic Studies. I'm also going to be looking at slaveholders in that preliminary research rather than the enslaved, because, as has already been mentioned by the papers, I kind of need to go to the slaveholders first in order to start looking at the enslaved. But I do envision doing that particularly using the Slave Voyages project and the African origins as well. So the Romish Empire project will measure British and Irish Catholic engagement in slaveholding and empire building in the Americas from around 1580 to 1776, and then any subsequent transcultural exchange on the identity and praxis of the British, Irish and Catholic community and its diaspora in Europe and the Atlantic Basin. I'm ending the research in 1776, partly because of the loss of the British North American colonies as a result of the American Revolution, but also the passing of the Papist Act in 1778, which lifted earlier corporal punishment applied to Roman Catholic priests in the British Isles. So American independence resulted in the granting of religious tolerance as a constitutional right, which redefined American Catholic relationships with their British and Irish co-religionists, as well as colleges, seminaries and religious houses on the continent. And the Papist Act signified a shift in attitude towards Roman Catholics in British politics, which culminated with the Catholic Emancipation Act in 1829. So the outcomes of the project, I hope, will include open access network analysis of British Catholic slaveholders and their imperial trade networks that maintained the exiled British Catholic Church throughout the Atlantic world. And the analysis will then contribute to a monograph that compares slaveholding British and Irish Catholic communities under divergent political and legal systems in Britain, Maryland, the British West Indies, and continental Europe. So just a little bit of historical context to this. The Protestant Reformation in the British Isles resulted in significant political, religious, and cultural changes. And as a result of legislation designed to enforce religious conformity, between the mid-16th and late 18th century, many British and Irish Catholics migrated to continental Europe. And from the institutions that they established there, and with the support of European monarchies, the Counter-Reformation to reconvert the British Isles to Roman Catholicism was launched. So this meant that the Reformation rendered British and Irish Catholics one of the most mobile and most self-conscious groups in the British Isles and Europe. And recent historiography on British and Irish Catholicism has begun to shed the moniker of recency, which, for those who don't know that, it's essentially open martyrological Catholicism at this point. And so it's produced more nuanced studies of British and Irish Catholic identity and mobility in Europe. And for anyone who is interested, I'd highly recommend Liam Chambers and Thomas O'Connor's College Communities Abroad as your starting point. But we also know at the same time, Europeans began colonising the Americas. This was well underway, and in 1492, the Spanish Crown made contact with the Americas and established themselves as the dominant force in the Atlantic until the British and French empires reached their maturity at the turn of the 18th century. And in pursuit of profit, European colonisers introduced slavery throughout the Americas. European secular and religious institutions and subjects of every nation and nationality and creed, owned slaves. And from the hubs of Lisbon, Nantes, Seville, Cadiz, and Liverpool, approximately 12 million Africans were trafficked into slavery between the 16th and 19th century. But before the end of the 18th century, aside from Cadiz, London, and Liverpool, a British or Irish Catholic institution in exile was present in each of these locations. So this frequency of early modern Europeans crossing political and linguistic boundaries has led Elias Jones and Jorge Canizares to advocate for entangled histories of the Atlantic, which dispel false distinctions between Latin or Catholic, Anglo or Protestant America, which was shaped by national narratives. And in terms of British and Irish Catholicism, Theodore Glickman has become a Creole pioneer here, and he has argued that early modern British and Irish Catholics actively pursued colonial expansion as a means to fortify their estates against the financial consequences of anti-Catholic legislation, and to demonstrate the compatibility of confessional pluralism, civil allegiance and mercantilism. But he also argues that Catholic actions in this way merely increase Protestant anxiety about overseas expansion altogether. But despite all of these interventions and despite the advent of the Protestant Reformation in the British Isles having been contemporaneous with European colonisation of the New World and Atlantic slave trade, British and Irish Catholic imperialism and slavery, especially in the early modern period, remains understudied. So just to explain this map here, the blue and green markers are the dominant slave ports in Europe. With the green ones, it's just a slave port, so you've got London and Liverpool there. The blue ones are Nantes, Seville and Lisbon, where we know that there is an exile community, or Roman Catholic exile community. The red markers are all of the convents, colleges and seminaries, and they cluster around the Low Countries, and this is important to come back to at the end, because until the Spanish War succession in 1701 to 1714, these are Habsburg-controlled territories, and that had a big impact on how British and Irish Roman Catholics engaged with slavery. So, to give an example of the methodological approach I'm thinking about, I picked up on two case studies. The first is Mary Digges, who was the daughter of William Digges and Elizabeth Sewell. Sewell was the stepdaughter of the third Lord Baltimore, Charles Calvert. And when she entered, so her dowry set at £400, which she likely inherited from her father's estate, which included 29 slaves. And by the time the Atlantic slave trade, and she entered at Liege into the Augustinian convent, I believe. By the time the Atlantic slave trade had reached its zenith in the 18th century, the Meade family of Montserrat was heavily represented in British and Irish Catholic institutions on the continent. So they were literally everywhere. France, the Low Countries, a number of different religious orders as well, including the Benedictines, Augustinians, and so on. And they were one of the wealthiest slave-holding planter families in the Caribbean. Thomas Meade was the father of Bridget Meade, whose capital invested in 200 enslaved persons and probated in 1815 according to the legacies of British slave ownership. Project stood at £3,333, 13 shillings and 11 pence. Thomas was listed as the previous owner of these slaves, but then when we actually look at his will, we also find out that Thomas had another daughter, Anne, and she was paid £10 a year, having entered religious life. And Anne was professed at the Augustinian convent in Leuven in 1749. So these records suggest that profit derived from slaves who belonged to British and Irish Catholic planters financially benefited British and Irish Catholic institutions on the continent. However, since slavery and its proceeds infiltrated every aspect of British and Irish society, this is perhaps to be expected. In isolation, these records do not confirm that British and Irish Catholic institutions in Europe actively solicited financial support derived from slavery. And equally, the financial records do not confirm that slaveholding families would not have otherwise supported British and Irish Catholic institutions had the British Empire never come to pass. And equally, they don't tell us whether they consciously recognise slavery as a means to protect exile Catholicism. It's actually only when we look at, well, in fact, before I do that, so this is the family tree of, cut in half to be on the screen, of the natural family of Ghent. They are a very prominent gentry reticent family. They were linked to royalist circles and extremely influential. All of the stars represent those who entered into religious life. The blue star at the top is a Jesuit, which is important for the guy we'll come on to now, Francis Natchwell, who I believe is this Francis Natchwell circled in blue here, but I need to go to the European archives to confirm that. But records such as the Natchwell Catechism, which was produced roughly 1675-1677, combined with these financial records, can help us understand the effects of slaveholding on British and Irish Catholic praxis. The Catechism was produced in Maryland by Brother Francis Natchwell of the Jesuit Order, and he alluded to elements of Thomas theology used by the Salamanca School to legitimise the enslavement of Africans. If anyone isn't familiar with the Salamanca School, it included people like Louis de Molina and Bartolomé de las Casas. Though further work in European archives again is required to confirm this, Natchwell's decision to directly reference Thomas theology in his catechism suggests that religious devotion may have been adapted to meet the needs of British and Irish Catholic slaveholding from which the church stood to gain. So, just to point this out here, these are two texts, one from Francisco de Pretoria, the Salamanca School, and this Natchwell Catechism. Essentially, you'll see somewhere in those red highlighted pieces of text that he describes the difference between someone who can be legitimately enslaved as invincibly ignorant, and someone who cannot as invincibly ignorant. And it was used by the Spanish to determine whether Native Americans or only Africans could be enslaved. So why is all of this important? Well, beyond simply better understanding how a legislative minority came to be the slaveholders, this project is also important for public history. The history of Catholicism, both in academic and public arenas, has tended to focus on British and Irish Catholics' ability to withstand the effects of the Protestant Reformation, the produced anti-Catholic legislation, and the martyrdom of 284 men and women before 1680. And each year, on the 4th of May, Catholic congregations across the UK celebrate Mass in commemoration of these men and women and for their actions to help protect Catholicism in the British Isles. Yet the debt owed to the enslaved, whose coerced labour in part may have financed that survival, is not commemorated. And if anything, a lot of the literature, even coming out of the Catholic Association for Racial Justice, which is a collection of British and Commonwealth Catholics fighting for racial justice within the Catholic Church, don't seem to reference slaveholding at all. So it's a very much unknown history. So this project therefore enables the British and the Irish Catholic Church the opportunity to better understand the means of its survival in the post-Reformation British Isles. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. We have time for a couple of questions before we do a change over to the next panel. So questions, please. Yes, Bruce.
How does the G272 connect to this?
The Georgetown Memorial Reconciliation. Yeah, absolutely. They, I think, are starting to establish a precedent. What that really concentrates on is 19th century history. The earliest record that the Georgetown Jesuits have is 1715. But there's no kind of trace back in terms of how that affects British and Irish Catholicism. And that's in part because there isn't a great deal of crossover between the two historiographies within the field. But I think it is something that needs to be looked at as this is a global phenomenon because British and Irish Catholics are migrating globally. And so this has kind of come out of my doctoral dissertation, which looked at Maryland. And what I was picking up on was these breadcrumbs of either wills that donated money back to like Douay and Lisbon and places like that, or you've also had a significant number of slaveholders who were also very powerful in Maryland, who had been trained on the continent. So, for example, Philip Calvert, he studied at the English College of Lisbon. You had Andrew White, who was a Jesuit, who knew Andrew Creswell, and they were all just kind of really big movers and shakers in the establishment of slavery there. So how that works, I think, is something to uncover.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much, Helen. So we will do a quick changeover to the next session. We have a break scheduled after the next session. Certainly, if you need to stand up and stretch your legs, now would be a good time, but I ask that the next session panelists come down here, and who's going to do the, yeah, and Ethan will handle the candy.
Yeah, well, you got a match. Is it the right one?
Yep, the one that works.
Test it, open it up, make sure.
Okay, so I think you're first. Yep, I'm just making sure this works.
First, so I would like to find.
So we'll have to change it on the screen.
You said it right.
Up there. Ethan?
Yes.
We need to press the button to make sure up there there's an input.
Is it this one?
Wait, before you do full screen.
Oh, yep, sorry.
Can I make sure mine's on?
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Let's do it, and then we'll test.
Okay.
You've got the mic?
Yep. Yes. Are you first?
Yes.
Perfect.
I don't know if there's another hill here.
Probably not. Probably just put it in. That's me.
Yeah, that's you.
Okay.
Okay.
And then I'll just minimize it. Is that okay?
Is that good or bad?
Okay. No, it's fabulous. I think it's great.
Okay.
So
right.
No, I just was not. I was just surprised.
Okay.
So
Okay.
like
Was it
no. It wasn't like a.
You're fine.
Okay.
I'm just
like,
gonna test
no,
this.
this will never attach,
Okay.
which is how I saw it.
No, I'm just surprised because I haven't ever seen like a thing before. So it's kind of like.
So check it. Camel here.
Oh yeah.
Wake up.
Okay, so I'm gonna unmute.
What's that?
You want to just put it in your pocket, or what do you want to do? What's easiest for you?
It never wants to.
Yep, you can put it in your pocket, so there's a clip, or you can put it on your belt buckle. So you are unmuted, unmuted, so you're live right now.
Cool.
I am alive. Yes, sorry. Okay.
Leave it. Leave it.
You can mute it if you want. It's this top button right here. Just make sure you press it again.
Host computer. Well, are you last?
I'm last.
You're last. Okay. So when you're done, go main menu and go back to host computer.
Right.
When you want it, you go main menu laptop.
Okay.
Not that you can see, but right now you are muted. Yes.
Something. Okay.
Yeah, it's your responsibility.
Not mine.
And if there's a problem, it's your fault.
Do not be afraid to say
Yes.
Okay.
no one can hear you.
Are we good with audio?
Yes, he's muted right now, but he knows how to unmute himself.
Okay.
And we got the other person all set.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah, we're all good. I'm gonna start doing this.
I'm going to walk away.
Perfect.
Okay, folks, let's get the show on the road. So next up is the fifth session, or speaker session 5. Is Plantation and the Material Remains of Slavery. In sort of kindness towards time, I'm going to introduce everybody first, and then they will come. So first off is Ben Brumfield from Brumfield Lab, the Stagville accounts of DEPCHA. All right. Plantation Financial Records is linked data. Then after that, it's going to be Terry Brock and Mary Furlong Minkoff. Terry is presenting from the Montpelier Foundation, connecting and sharing the lives of the enslaved community at James, this is the longest title ever. It's good. James Madison's Montpelier through the Montpelier Digital Collection Project. And last up is Joby Hill from the Saving Slave House Project, the Slave House Database, a much shorter title.
Okay, thank you. Micro? Okay, good deal. So I'd like to start by mentioning that this is the result of a big collaboration, 2 collaborations in fact. The first one between myself and the primary researcher on the Stagville accounts, Anna Ugby-Davies, who is an anthropologist and historical archaeologist at UNC Chapel Hill. The second one is the result of a Mellon and HPRC funded digital edition publishing cooperative that attempted to focus on historic financial records and to model those as in a shared linked data database. And I only mention the people here who were involved specifically in analyzing the Stagville accounts. We also had people working with the Schlitz papers and other kinds of financial records. I regret that many of the rest of my colleagues were unable to be here. So I'm a software engineer, so as a result, I apologize if my methodologies are a little bit over technical or if my history is naive. So, some background first. So Historic Stagville is a historic site run by the state of North Carolina. It's about 15 miles north of Durham, North Carolina. And it is one of several historic sites, but it's the one in the Raleigh-Durham area that really focuses on the perspective of the enslaved individuals who lived on this tobacco plantation from the late 18th through the Civil War and on into, in many cases, Emancipation. There's a descendant community that's still very active around there. The site was owned by the Benahan and Cameron families, who were up at the brink of the Civil War, were very wealthy. They owned over 30,000 acres of land and almost 900 enslaved human beings. You can see here a rather unusual preservation of one of the slave dwellings, a 4-room multifamily dwelling. There's 4 of those that still exist on the site. So the Cameron family papers are held at the Southern History Collections at UNC. And these include a lot of business records. Some of them include transactions between the Plantation store and members of the community, both slave and free members. And of particular interest to this group is one particular document called the Slave Ledger, which is a separate account book recording transactions between the Cameron store and enslaved customers. So if we look closely, we can see really interesting detail about the lives of the enslaved customers of the account. So here we have someone named, an account under the name of Walters Davy. And we see that he buys all blades, half a dozen all blades. Later he buys sugar and a shoe knife. He buys a quart of whiskey, and later he buys leather slippers. All right? And he pays by half-soling shoes on one day, and on another day by providing 1 pair of shoes, making 1 pair of shoes for Sam. 1 pair of shoes for Sam made. All right, so what's interesting about this kind of detail is that, this is a person who, in a legal sense, may be a commodity, but he's not acting as a commodity here. He is a person who is using his cobbling skills to navigate the restrictions of slavery. If we look at the accounts overall, we see account holders described in a bunch of different ways. We see nicknames, we see patronymics, we see ownership. Most of the account holders are male, but not all. If we turn to qualitative methods, we can ask questions like, how does an enslaved customer pay their debts with their account at the store? Most of them, the largest quantity, are paid using in payments of wood. After that is cash and labor. We see some really interesting things here too, like for example, people who are coming in and they're selling shoes like we saw earlier, right? Or they're selling tobacco, or they're selling blacking, right? So we have people who are buying manufactured materials, producing it, and bringing it back, right? These accounts, the slave ledger doesn't exist in isolation. Here is another account from the white account books. Here's James Haley, who's coming in 1808, and he's also buying a shoe knife for 1 shilling 6 pence. Humphrey Davy, 2 years later, is buying a shoe knife for 2 shillings. Is the 33% increase in price because it's a different shoe knife? Is it inflation over 2 years? It doesn't have something to do with the status of the customer. So moving to methodology, Anna Ogby Davies encoded the ledger with an open source transcription platform that I run called From the Page. She was able to fund the development of tools for specifically encoding tabular data and being able to extract it for analytical purposes. However, it still exists to some extent in isolation. We have the Cameron family papers in these accounts by themselves in a digital edition. So as part of the digital edition publishing cooperative, we turn to a different platform called GAMS, which is Geisteswissenschaftliche Asset Management System out of the University of Graz, Austria. And GAMS is a way of taking transcripts that have been encoded in TEI, adding some light annotative tags to them, and then extracting the concepts behind them, the concepts that are being recorded in the texts, and producing them in a linked data database. To handle this, the Center for Information Modeling at University of Graz created an RDF ontology called the bookkeeping ontology. It seems to map most of the kinds of transactions and concepts that we find recorded in these very disparate kinds of documents, though we did have to add some more as we worked through this process. So that's really abstract. How do you get stuff into RDF, right? Nobody wants to hand encode any of that stuff. So from the page, we'll produce TEI exports, and for this project, we added the bookkeeping ontology. So any kind of TEI document, all you have to do is add these little tags saying Anna equals BK underscore what, for example, saying analyze this as what was being transferred, analyze this as when, analyze this as an entry. So once this is done and ingested into GAMS, we have the ability to look at transactions outside of the context of the documents themselves. So here we see records from the white ledgers of sales of powder to 2 people. Well, these records don't occur on the same page, right? But we can see them and how much they're paying for them and what they're buying them with. We can even go across this, so we see Stagville Plantation store transactions involving powder, but we can also compare them against transactions in the Wheaton Financial Papers, which is a store in 1840s Massachusetts. More interesting is looking at, say, the Washington Family Papers, which are contemporary and also reflect a slave society. We can do some analytics. We can look at the things people are buying along with buying powder. Unsurprisingly, they are most often buying shot and gun flints, but they're also sometimes buying knives, pins, and sugar. Maybe they're preserving. And since GAMS is a platform for integrating linked data about transactions, and since it has a role for people both as customers and as account holders, we feel like it presents an interesting opportunity to connect to databases like Enslaved that are also based on linked data. So that's what I've got.
Wow. So we have ample time for questions for Ben. Questions?
Could you explain every detail of the previous slide to this one?
This one?
No, the previous one.
The ontology.
Go back to it.
The ontology?
That
right. Okay. I did not develop this. This was new to me as well. This is my collaborators. Yeah. All right.
We got a couple of questions.
Oh,
same question. Okay.
Where is this?
So this is on. If you go to this bottom link here, medea.hypotheses.org, you can see references to GOMS. Talk with me later and I can connect you with the bookkeeping ontology and how-to bookkeeping, which is a kind of how-to guide by Georg Vogler at the Center for Information Modeling at Graz.
Any other questions?
So I have a question. It's kind of a controlled vocabulary question.
Yes.
So when you say that powder is coming up in your data,
Right.
are you doing any, because I guess I'm wondering about the TEI and the controlled vocabularies.
Right.
Are you literally just pulling the stuff that's tagged? Is there any controlling for the terms that are
We're doing vocabulary control at 2 levels. So during transcription, when people are working within from the page in this case, or doing raw TEI tagging, they have a chance to normalize whatever they're putting in, right? So we see flints and we see gun flints, and Anna has resolved those and said those, canonically speaking, are going to be gun flints. She categorizes them in the digital edition as however she does. She's an anthropologist and I'm not, right? According to her own ontology. What we would like to do, and another stage of this project, is to reference that to the Getty ontology or to the ontology that's been created by the Washington Financial Papers to map their material, so that we can look at things like how much is being spent on alcoholic beverages, and that would include both whiskey and rum, and look across these different editions. So it's the same kind of mapping problem that the Enslaved project is running into.
And so this one person is doing the definitions for these vocabularies, and have they been published?
So it's not one person doing the definitions. We have a group of people as part of the DEPCHA project. The Washington Financial Papers have published theirs. The Stagville ones are online if you go to fromthepage.com and look for Stagville. And you'll click on subjects and there's a way of browsing by categories there. And then mapping it to a more global ontology like the Getty has not been done yet.
Let's have, we had one more question. Do you still?
How many people were enslaved at Stagville, and do you know what the values of those people were? How much, you see the inventory of how much was paid for those individuals over time?
That I would have to defer to my colleagues. Sorry.
Okay, so join me in thanking Ben.
Awesome, thank you.
I don't know if I'll stand there yet. And then if you got a pocket or something like that. There you go.
Well, that was cool. We're going to go from that really wonderful technical piece to one that's a whole lot less technical. My name is Terry Brock. I'm the Assistant Director of Archaeology at the Montpelier Foundation. And I'm going to talk about a project that doesn't quite exist yet, that we're in the process of starting to plan. So I was going to talk a little bit about how we are planning to do this project. All right. So for those of you who don't know, the Montpelier Foundation is a cultural heritage institution located in Orange, Virginia, and is the early 19th century home of James Madison, our nation's 4th president, and his wife Dolly Madison, our first lady, as well as over 300 individuals who are held in bondage by the Madisons. So my comments today are going to be coming from the perspective of an institution that really focuses on public work and creating projects for the public to consume. The database project that we are starting to look at creating comes from lessons that we've learned in the making of the Mere Distinction of Color exhibition. This exhibition is a collaborative and multi-award winning permanent exhibit that combined research in documentary and oral history, archaeological excavations and artifacts, architectural reconstruction, and decorative arts to explore the institution of slavery and the lives of the people enslaved by the Madisons at Montpelier. It was also conceived and conducted in collaboration with members of the Montpelier descendant community. The exhibit has led to a number of new initiatives based on the things that we've learned through the process of building the exhibition, both in terms of what enhanced and what hindered our ability to carry out the project. First, it was clear that collaboration among departments and data sets was integral to an effective interpretation of slavery. But our collections themselves were not very well integrated to allow us to do that work efficiently. Second, it was also evident that our institution lacked the digital infrastructure that would have been necessary to provide a type of digital or online version of this exhibition that we're now finding people would really like us to have. Third, it strengthened our institutional commitment to engaging descendants in all aspects of our research and interpretation. So our intention with this paper, therefore, is to discuss our plans for the Montpelier Digital Collections Project, how we are adopting an inclusive approach to its creation, and why we think this approach is critical to those of us engaging with the digital interpretation of slavery, particularly for digital projects who enlist the general public as a potential user. Working on mere distinction made three components clear about what would be needed for more effective public interpretation. First is descendant engagement. The winter following the release of Mere Distinction, Montpelier hosted a summit on teaching slavery, supported by the National Trust for Historic Preservation's African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, and to develop what would end up being the rubric for engaging descendant communities, which is a guide for cultural heritage institutions interested in doing more effective interpretation of slavery. The rubric highlighted three major components where descendant engagement, the people who attended this workshop thought descendant engagement was critical. Multidisciplinary research, relationship building, and the interpretation process. The creation of this rubric has really codified our approach as an institution to research and to our interpretive projects, ensuring that members of the descendant community are consulted and included in the projects from the beginning. Second thing is collaborative collections. While multidisciplinary research was central to the way Mere Distinction was developed, it became clear that the way each department's collection was organized and designed stood in the way of efficient and effective collaborative work. We have 4 disciplinary collections at Montpelier: archaeology, architecture, research, and decorative arts. And each of those is made up of even smaller collections based on objects. Some are paper records, transcriptions, architectural fragments, study collections, so on and so on and so on. Each of these is housed in different databases or spreadsheets or paper. Some databases are designed for research analysis first, while others are strictly for collections management. Without a central digital repository, collaboration became increasingly difficult as we worked to put together this exhibition. Each department had its own gatekeeper, its own person who knew how the database worked, and many other people did not understand or didn't know or had never even been into the inner workings of each other's database. So it became very clear as we finished this project that developing a more collaborative database system was an obvious need as we moved forward. It was also clear that we'd missed an opportunity to build an online version of Mere Distinction to extend the exhibit to broader audiences. In part, this was due to a lack of funding, which of course is what we all deal with that. But it also stemmed from a lack of institutional emphasis on online engagement, which meant we lacked both a digital infrastructure and the technical expertise to really conceive of or even build such an exhibit. Now, due to the success of the exhibit, we have visitors and stakeholders who want to see Mere Distinction from afar and to use it in their classes and so on and so forth. And we're unprepared to be able to fulfill that need. As a result of these 3 factors, we've decided that an online collections management system could address many of these problems. The system would integrate our disparate collections, improving our ability to collaborate internally and increase accessibility of our collections to the public, while establishing a digital infrastructure to support new digital initiatives. And we knew that in order for that system to most effectively contribute to our efforts to interpret the African American story at Montpelier, it needed to include descendants in the project's design and implementation. Early meetings between department representatives made it clear the immense challenge that we had ahead of us. We did not find the presentations by out-of-the-box CMS companies malleable enough for the type of customization that we required, particularly considering the potential for stakeholder needs and really having no idea what those needs might be. We decided that the complexity of the system and our commitment to stakeholder involvement required more than a client-provider relationship. And so we went seeking a partner. We settled on this small little group here at Michigan State called Matrix. I think you all kind of understand why at this point. So we found an institutional partner that we I believe is going to be invested in both the project process and the outcomes. And then a little bit of money came along, which was also really nice. So this past fall, we received NEH Digital Humanities Advancement Planning Grant that's going to allow us to actually start the planning process for this project. When we began discussing our plan, what the planning process would look like, we wanted to put as much thought and care into the process of creating the database as the final product and ensure that we were engaging as many stakeholders as we could. We settled on a two-step process. First, an online survey to gain a broad set of quantifiable data from a variety of stakeholders, and an in-person workshop to bring together experts and community representatives. The survey is available on the project website and is designed to cast a wide net to find out from potential users what kind of online collections tool they would find useful. And you can visit this website right now if you really are feeling up to it. The survey will be distributed to a variety of stakeholders, including the broader descendant community. By the time of the workshop, we'll have accumulated the data and make it accessible to the workshop participants so that everyone attending has a broad base of understanding of what potential users are looking for in the project. Then in July, we'll hold a 2.5-day workshop. The 45 workshop participants will represent a variety of project stakeholders, including digital humanities scholars, museum professionals, educators, descendants, collectors, volunteers, and genealogists. Participants were selected to make sure we have representation of expertise or interest from each of the different types of collections that will be featured in the database and from all of the different stakeholder groups. During the workshop, participants will tour Montpelier's collections, see the exhibitions, and hear presentations from fellow participants who have created successful digital projects relating to one of the collection types. We'll also present the preliminary results of the survey. And on day 2, participants will apply the information they received on the first day to develop a plan for the database through a series of breakout sessions organized around themes such as identifying and serving audiences, collection types as needs, next steps, and so on. We'll also make sure the workshop is publicly accessible through live streaming and social media. And the final product, a white paper, will outline the results of the workshop and propose next steps, and will also be made available for comments and will be critical for future efforts to gain additional funding to actually complete the project. And we expect to continue this kind of multi-level engagement strategy as we implement the different phases of the project as well. Since our project is largely speculative at this point, I wanted to discuss a little bit more about why we decided to emphasize on collaboration, particularly descendant collaboration, in the process of doing this digital project. We found our engagement process at Montpelier to be mutually beneficial for both the institution and the community. Over the past few decades, Montpelier has worked with the African American descendant community to ensure that our approach to understanding Montpelier is inclusive and expresses more than a whitewashed version of the past. This has come in the forms of descendant gatherings, prioritizing African American spaces through physical reconstruction and interpretation, and including descendants in the process of conducting research. They've worked on our archaeological excavations, conducted oral histories, and advised us on interpretive efforts such as the 1870s Gilmore Cabin and the 1920s segregated train station that are also on the property. Mere Distinction was one of our first real opportunities to put the needed funds behind a collaborative project, and the dividends for both groups has been evident. When applied to a digital project, we expect similar outcomes that have resulted from our non-digital projects. These include a better product. The end result of a collaborative project is often a better product. Mere Distinction is a clear example of that. The descendants decided the themes of the exhibition to connect the past to the present and to explore the humanity of their ancestors, themes that may not have emerged if we had been left to our own devices. We have little doubt that their perspective will add to the digital project in ways that we otherwise would have missed. Collaborative work makes for better work, and this shouldn't be any different for when those projects move online. Second, a collaborative project results in a final product that is useful to the people who are consuming it. Mere Distinction is an exhibit that addresses the concerns of the African American community, and our descendant community see themselves and their voices in the exhibit because they're literally in the exhibit, and it reflects the stories that they want to tell. Our hope is that a digital collections database designed with their input in mind will result in a product that they will find useful. And third, participation in collaborative work gives ownership over the spaces and objects that are traditionally owned by primarily white institutions. Right? I do work at a plantation. Right? By participating in the process of research, discovery, and interpretation, descendants engage in placemaking and ownership over the spaces and objects lived on and owned by their ancestors. By incorporating them into the process of designing the digital database, and to build it in a way that is useful to them, they can claim expertise and ownership over the objects themselves, a process that democratizes, a democratizing process, and that will hopefully combat some of the structural inequalities that are built into our institutions. We think that it can be very easy for digital projects to be seen as disparate and separate from human beings, not only those in the past, but also those in the present. We often think of working on digital exhibits for the general public or building digital tools for researchers, and often assume that because something online and accessible, it will also be useful to the public. But rarely are we actually incorporating digital communities into the process of designing and building the project itself. Okay. I'm almost done, Ethan, promise. And because we believe community engagement is essential to the public interpretation of slavery, and because this is a conference of digital scholars studying the topic of slavery, I think it is a critical exercise for us all to consider how we are engaging descendant communities in our projects. There's a chance for us to do even more powerful and meaningful work through a collaborative approach. Thank you.
All right, we have a couple of minutes for a question for Terry. Everybody fears the timer.
It's almost stroked out there. It was really flashy.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, how is the sort of white elite of the area, the keepers of the traditional history, how are they reacting to some of the things you're doing, trying to emphasize more and more the lives and histories of most of the people who actually
Could you repeat the beginning of the question? There's some sort of race going on upstairs. Something, I'm not sure. Moving furniture.
How are white elites in the area and keepers of the traditional history reacting to what you're doing to try to emphasize more and more the lives and histories of most of the people who actually lived and worked?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the question is, how are white elites reacting to the emphasis on interpreting African American stories? Honestly, we haven't gotten a lot of bad feedback for things like that. It's not. I mean, it's not like we're not receiving donations or support for this for the product. You know, certainly visitors will occasionally get feedback that is about, you know, you're denigrating the legacy of James Madison by talking about the fact that he owned people, things like that, right? But that's the reality of that's what happened. So we haven't really gotten a lot of pushback beyond what you would kind of typically expect. Yeah.
Among your funders, I don't see it might have been just the funders for this project.
Yes.
But you didn't list the state of Virginia, the Commonwealth, excuse me. Does the Commonwealth of Virginia support?
We're a nonprofit. Our property is owned by the National Trust and then administered by the Montpelier Foundation. So I mean, if we get a grant from the state from the Commonwealth, then they would be. But
you do get grants, or you don't?
Some, I mean, if we applied for them or they were available, or we received them, but we're not like a line item in the state budget or something.
No, I was asking if they support them. And what you're telling me is if you ask, they would, but they don't. Does the Commonwealth of Virginia fund you?
I do not believe we are getting any funding from the Commonwealth of Virginia, but I'm also just the assistant director of archaeology, so.
I just say that Virginia has no such program as a neighbor of Canada.
That's right. That's right.
Similar, private nonprofit.
Yeah.
Virginia just doesn't fund. It has its own, historic sites.
Yeah.
Jamestown, Yorktown.
Exactly.
But it doesn't offer money for non-state.
A director of archaeology up there. So. took one couple steps up. Yes.
My question is simple. You spoke of discussing with descendants the themes for your work, and you used them. So my question is, do those descendants, stakeholders, are any of the themes to the negative of what went on at the property?
Yeah. So the two themes that they wanted us to focus on was connecting the past to the present, so examining the legacies of slavery. And the second one was enhancing and telling the stories, humanizing their ancestors. Excuse me. So yes, I do think that the.
So does that suggest that if if I am a descendant and I know that my ancestor had 100 lashes on the property, are you getting that kind? That's what I mean by the negative side.
Yes. Yeah, so those kinds of topics
are coming out. Did they come up with that, or they just say humanizing?
I wasn't in the actual workshop that happened for that, but all kinds of things were discussed, and I really encourage you to come see the exhibit, and you get a good feel. Maybe I'm not answering the question effectively. I apologize. Okay. All right.
We got, is anyone, okay, so join me in thanking Terry, and then we'll go to our last.
You got transfer power here.
Yeah,
I'll just take everything. She's waking up.
You're good to go. Do I use the arrow to move forward? Okay. I'm just going to start. Okay. Slavery was different for every single person who experienced it. Free, freed, or enslaved. There are broad patterns and similarities between the daily life of the enslaved from one plantation to the next. But in order to truly begin to understand human dimensions associated with slave houses, one must carefully consider the descriptions given by someone who actually lived and worked in these buildings. Narratives from formerly enslaved people provide insight into the uses, activities, and feelings associated with a historic slave house. Details that fuse a voice about the human condition with the physical structure. The anthropological history, in combination with the preservation of the historic slave house, reveals a part of history that cannot be gleaned from the historical record alone. Appreciating the plantation landscape through the perspective of the enslaved community takes time and patience and must be done on a holistic level. This means approaching the landscape of slavery with an open mind and a willingness to let go of preconceived ideas and beliefs about the people who built and lived in these structures. It also requires the ability to accept grim and sometimes vile truths. True insight about what life was like for enslaved people can only be gained by examining how and why enslaved people made decisions, and above all, accepting their mechanisms to survive oppression. For example, history's definition of a slave owner is a person who owned or enslaved another human being. But to an enslaved person, a slave owner was also a slave breeder and trader. If a slave owner at any time forced a person to reproduce, or if a slave owner profited from an enslaved female having a child, then he was a slave breeder. And if a slave owner at any time sold or bought an enslaved person, then he was also a slave trader. You didn't have to be breeding or trading enslaved people by the hundreds to bear this title. Committing this moral crime only once earned you this label. Slave owners were not shy about expressing their interest in and belief that they had the right to control the reproductive rights and schedules of enslaved women. At Monticello in Charlottesville, Virginia, Thomas Jefferson wrote, "I consider a woman who brings a child every 2 years as more profitable than the best man on the farm. What she produces is an addition to the capital, while his labors disappear in mere consumption." The Macy family of Parcelia Plantation in Nelson County, Virginia, kept a stock which documented the details of over 350 births from enslaved women spanning more than 100 years. And at Green Hill Plantation in Campbell County, Virginia, Samuel Pennell was so proud of his slave breeding and trading activities that he built a stone slave auction block and auctioneer stand right outside his front door. It is these historical accounts and the psychological trauma that they inflicted on enslaved people that we must remember when interpreting the landscape of slavery and slave houses. Today I'm going to describe the research I've been doing and the evidence that I've found that helps shed new light on what the historic slave house really stands for. The focus of my research is to preserve both the physical structure of America's historic slave house
as well as the history of the inhabitants of these structures. Since 2011, my research and professional work as an architect has focused exclusively on domestic slave buildings. In 2012, I started an independent project titled the Slave House Database. The database, in 2012, I started an independent project titled the Slave House Database as an effort to ensure that slave houses, which are irreplaceable pieces of history, are not lost forever. The Slave House Database is a central repository for information and data pertinent to all the known slave houses in the United States. The database is a crosswalk for diverse fields to access and reference. It can be used to identify, locate, analyze, and interpret slave houses, as well as connect to other resources. Currently, the database has over 170,000 files of mostly unpublished materials. This includes 1,131 ex-slave narratives describing the house where they lived during slavery. The Slave House Database has two parts, documentation and interpretation. The documentation is the visual representation of the spaces, and the interpretations are descriptions of the spaces from the actual inhabitants who lived and worked there during slavery. The architectural drawings and images of slave houses represent snapshots in time. In this context, slave houses are considered artifacts, and like all artifacts, they can convey important messages about their makers, occupants, and uses. The most direct way of getting at an accurate interpretation of the uses, activities, and feelings associated with historic slave house is through the accounts left by the former slaves themselves. The narratives recorded from the formerly enslaved people breathe life into the two-dimensional drawings and photographs of slave houses. The Slave House Database includes new current documentation for each of the slave houses. This documentation represents survey work I've been doing since 2013 and will continue to do. The Historic American Building Survey, or HABS, collection has been the primary focus of my research thus far. Therefore, it will be the first collection that I complete survey work for. This phase of the survey work involves locating and resurveying the HABS documented slave houses in the U.S. To date, I have completed surveys of approximately 700 buildings at over 140 sites across 6 states and have driven over 9,000 miles. The goals for my survey work are to 1, identify which of the HABS documented slave houses still exist, to document the current conditions of these structures, and 3, to record the architectural information that is missing from the original survey. For myself, fieldwork provides a perspective that can only be gained from personally interacting with and experiencing the space. There's no substitute for standing in a slave house and experiencing the overwhelming rush of emotions that comes with this. The plantation landscapes are typically studied from the slave owners or white society's point of view, which only provides one narrow perspective. Slave owners were interested in and controlled the overall design of the plantation landscape. This included building locations, materials, size, and style. Therefore, landscapes are traditionally analyzed starting with the site plan, then moving to individual buildings and ending with details. But when discussing the architecture of the enslaved community, one must approach it from the reverse, or from the inside out, and be receptive to new interpretations. Enslaved people controlled only the details of the architecture, not the master plan. That is why an analysis of a slave house must start with and focus on the details of how it was constructed and used. These details reveal that a slave house is a complex, irreplaceable piece of history that embodies suffering, yet perseverance, and strong family bonds. A slave house is like every other American home, a sacred place. A slave house was where family was, so it was a place where enslaved people found strength and comfort from one another. But at the same time, it was a place that imposed physical limitations and psychological trauma. Family was the most important and precious part of an enslaved individual's life. Family was used as a survival mechanism. It gave enslaved people strength, hope, and comfort during insufferable times. The size of a slave house affected how a family or a group of families interacted on a personal and intimate level. It is imperative to know and to always keep in mind that every decision an enslaved person made had cruel and excessive consequences attached to it. These consequences would have significantly impacted their life and in some cases ended their life. Ella Booth remembered while she was enslaved on the Wilkes Plantation, her family was going hungry, so her father stole a chicken from the slave owner. His punishment for stealing the chicken was that he had to kill it with his bare hands and eat it raw, and then he was whipped. Every decision an enslaved person made should be recognized as poignant, no matter how small or insignificant the decision may seem to us. The size of one's house and living arrangement would have further complicated one of the hardest decisions every enslaved person had to make, whether or not to start a family. This is, if they even had the benefit of making this decision for themselves. For enslaved women, starting a family meant your children could be taken from you and sold at any time and for any reason. It also meant that you would have to perform your regular work responsibilities while pregnant and nursing. And one of the most terrifying realities was that once a woman became pregnant, she was vulnerable to potentially being used for breeding purposes. For some women, these consequences were too much to bear. Enslaved people were given inadequate resources to build their homes with. As a way for slave owners to assert their dominance, dehumanize the enslaved community, and set them up for failure. This behavior by slave owners was commonplace, so it was only natural that enslaved people developed a way to resist and overcome. Close examination of extant slave houses showed that enslaved carpenters knew how to build their houses so that aesthetically they were within the accepted social hierarchies of slavery, but at the same time they were inconspicuously constructed with the finest craftsmanship. The houses that survive today represent the better built structures and were more than likely constructed by the same skilled carpenters and artisans that built the main house, which is why they still survive today, with many being neglected for over 150 years. Slave houses were built in a way that allowed enslaved people to ensure that their legacies would live on. Enslaved builders used the details in buildings as hidden messages of resistance, strength, and perseverance. They incorporated survival mechanisms into their architecture, discreetly showed off their unrivaled carpentry skills, and left behind personal signatures. The most telling detail of any slave house is the fireplace. Fireplaces epitomize the complexities of enslaved people and slave houses. First, they remind us how fragile and precious human life is. Second, fireplaces represent a sacred place where women provided nourishment, clothing, warmth, and comfort for their families. And third, they demonstrate perseverance and a deliberate act of resistance, and that they could be built extraordinarily well, and sometimes with elaborate details that were hidden from the outside world. The wide variety in form and construction suggests that the design of fireplaces was left to the discretion of the enslaved and not dictated by the slave owners. This makes each fireplace a very personal and significant feature of the house. The relationship between the historical record and the stories of the inhabitants is crucial to our understanding and interpretation of the lifeways and settings of enslaved people. Extant slave houses provide an opportunity to directly interact with irreplaceable pieces of history and experience some of the harsh conditions of slavery firsthand. In order to walk in the footsteps of enslaved people and gain new perspectives, we must let the narratives from formerly enslaved people guide us along unfamiliar paths and trust that in the end, they will bring us to greater insight and empathy. This lesson from Caleb Craig on how to count the number of enslaved people there were on his plantation in South Carolina sums up well this philosophy, and I'm paraphrasing. There's a whole parcel of slaves in the quarter, about 300 or maybe more. I couldn't count to 100 then, so I didn't count them, but I can count now. 10, 10, double 10, 45, 15. Doesn't that equal 100? Sure it does. So let's, I'm sure you're guessing that. First thought, there's no way this equals 100. And how and why would anyone ever count to 100 like this? But let's test it. 10 plus 10, double 10 is 20, plus 45 plus 15. He's right, it equals 100. And that's it.
We have time for questions for Gregory.
Hi there, great presentation. Have you been able to put specific people from narratives within the specific
should mention it, yeah. So a big part of my research was to look at sites and the slave narratives. And I have been able to match specific narratives with specific sites. So for example, there are 485 HABS documented sites. So HABS sites for the slave house. And there are 1,010 WPA narratives that describe their house during slavery. Between those two collections, there's only 5 sites that match. So there's only 5 narratives that actually describe a specific documented slave house. So it can be done, but it's very rare, and it takes a long time to do.
We have another question right there, and then we'll go down there.
So, what should we do if we're out and about, looking around, and we run across what we think are pretty sure are slave quarters that are being run? This has happened to me more than once in Piedmont, North Carolina. I don't live there, from there, I don't live there, so I'm not in touch with anybody, and I don't know what to do. I just want to say, look, we have to do something to preserve this. What should we do?
You can email me and tell me.
That's what I'm, as of today, I think I know what to do. Before today, I never knew what to do.
Yeah, so, I mean, you can, like I said, you can email me, and then what I do is, I mean, not right away, I have to be around in this state, but, I mean, I have an ongoing list for every state, and as I find funding, I go and I contact the owners, because a lot of these sites are on private property. That's also another, that's another big part of this, is to get out there and at least document these structures before they disappear, if they are being neglected.
Can we talk later today then?
Yeah.
We have a question down there, and then we'll go up to the back.
My first question is to the Massey family.
Yeah.
And you identified they kept a log, and they gave numeration to how many babies were born. My question is, was someone in the family midwife?
Okay, so the question is about the Massey family stock book. Not that I found, no one was a midwife, so that they actually did not keep track of. I showed a picture of it. That stock book was just a list of birth dates. So I went through and transcribed that book, and that's how I know how many births there were. But it's just an ongoing list that the family kept over generations. Like one of the Macy's started it, and it just was passed on to his sons. And it's just an ongoing list of all the births of the enslaved women that they were used for breeding. They just kept track of it through generation after generation. And all that they had on one plantation, they had a slave hospital. One of the sons was a doctor. And there was a nursery in the main house, but I have not found any evidence of a midwife, but I also haven't dug any more into the family besides that stuff.
But the Macy's were an African descended family, right?
No, the Macy's were the white family. The Macy's, the white family.
I got it. All right, and then I have this other question, small, and that is, those houses look exceptionally well done compared to what my own family talks about and shows us. And so my question is, how representative are those houses that you see or found for various locations? I saw your map about where houses are, and that's clear, but boy, those houses look well.
Yeah, so the question is how well did the houses I showed represent slave houses in general? So these houses are the better built structures. These houses are the ones that are near the main house. So a lot of times they were constructed to sometimes fit in with the main house. So they have architectural details that the main house may have had. So they're there, a lot of times they're there to complement the main house in some way. These were not the ones that we kind of think of about, like the ones that be out in the field, like far away from the main house, that were more temporary houses, like that were logged and were moved west, the crops moved. So these are the nicer, well.
I know why you would call houses collectively in this fashion with these images, but I think you might want to consider bringing that, calming that down a little bit. Because to say, if we follow houses, we're going to, I'll talk to you later.
We had one more question in the back there, and then we'll break.
Yeah, thanks. That's just an amazing presentation about an even more amazing project. With just the ambition of it is fantastic and needed. And so, probably the majority of people in this room are academic historians, and we know things because we're academic historians, but we also forget things or don't see things because we're academic historians. And people told us those things, right, that we're forgetting, but I just wanted to open the door for you and wanted to close out by telling us something else that we're not seeing because we're academic historians, but what you're seeing from doing this project. Or just reiterate something, from talk that you really want us to take away with us along those lines.
So when you think of slave houses, houses are, one, they were multi-functional buildings, so workspaces were also slave houses. So the kitchens, wash houses, slave houses. And slave houses changed use over time repeatedly. So, it may have been a slave house at one time, a kitchen at one time. I have found documentation of a smokehouse being a slave house at one time. You never would have thought of that, but if at any time someone was living in it or using it as housing, it was a slave house. So, they just were used for different things at different times in multi-use spaces. And also, when we refer to these structures, we need to be referring to them as houses and not like outbuildings. It's much easier to get rid of an outbuilding than it is someone's home. So these buildings are just as important and just as sacred as the main house. So we need to be thinking of them and referring to them that way and not just as another building on the plantation landscape. So that's my pitch for you.
All right, it's time of the day for break. Walter wants me to come down.
So yes, it's time, almost time for
That's
break.
what I was saying.
As you saw from this panel and the one before that, one of the really exciting aspects of this this conference and of the project is that we are pulling together academic historians with the more public-facing historians, and indeed also with many members of the public. And one of the things we're clearly interested in engaging with scholars and providing a tool for scholars. But a major part of this project is also outreach to the public, getting K-12 classrooms involved, getting genealogists involved, getting anybody who's interested in their own family history or in the subject of slavery and the slave trade involved with this project. And we have a lot of members of the community here. One of the other exciting avenues that the project has taken, and you'll see this tomorrow, is that we have a very fruitful partnership right now with Family Search. And indeed, we will hear tomorrow from some of our Family Search partners. But if you want to grab them at a break and ask some questions about some of the exciting things that Family Search is doing and that we're doing with Family Search and they're doing with us, you can find Bruce Hansen, who's right here, and his partner Seth, who is right here. And also back here we have Brent, who's also from Family Search. And they'll be around the rest of today and tonight, of course, and tomorrow. And then something else, I was thrilled today to meet Quentin Atkinson from Ancestry, who also happened to come to this conference to learn from us and we from him. So welcome. Okay, we have until 3:35, is that right? So about 15 minutes. There is coffee, there is tea, and we have cookies and some snacks upstairs. So take about a 15-minute break, and then about 3:35, please convene here again.
first thing I'm going to do is ask